Hello and welcome to the next episode of Cylinder Radio. I'm your host, Will Roosh, high school teacher in Los Angeles, trying to flush out the nuance around controversial issues. And on this show, I've done 108 episodes or something. I've covered race and LGBTQ stuff and guns and abortion. And one of the really polarizing issues that I haven't touched on yet, we're going to get to today, which is climate change. And part of the reason is I was like, I got to find someone who understands the nuance around this, and instead of getting one person from the left and one person from the right, just someone who can kind of understand the whole thing. And I think I got him with Matthew Burgess, who is a professor at the University of Colorado Boulder in environmental studies and economics. And I met him at the Heterodox Academy conference where he gave a speech that was a seminar that was really excellent. I was like, that's the guy. So Matthew, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. And hopefully we can try and get some clarity on this really polarizing issue.
Yeah, cool. Thanks a lot for having me. And I appreciate teachers diving into these kinds of issues and hopefully role modeling the kinds of nuance that we want our students to have. Because one of the things that I always tell my students in my classes is these are serious issues, so you need to take them seriously. And taking them seriously means exploring the nuances and exploring what works and what doesn't and why. And anything less than that isn't doing justice to the seriousness of the issue, and therefore, doesn't deserve to wrap itself in any kind of, morally righteous cloth.
Yeah, that's a weird thing, right? Because with climate change, it becomes this moral thing with Greta Thunberg saying shame on you, you're bad, that goes viral because it's a clear thing of, people who are against, acknowledging climate change or who are acting in ways that are overtly against environmental protection or something like that, then they are the bad guys. So we have a nice little good versus evil. And we all love the good versus evil, playing out, but it is fairly complex, I'm guessing. Just diving right into it. Well, I guess first about you. What brought you into this world of learning about climate change and how to study it and understand it, and then hopefully, fix it or something along those. How did you become this? This is your niche area.
So, I was in academia in some form or other as a PhD student, as a postdoc, for 9 years before I became faculty. And I actually, until I became faculty, mostly didn't work on climate change. I started out as a hybrid between an ecologist and an economist, and applied math, theory was kind of my thing. And I did a lot of modeling, mathematical modeling on things like, managing natural resources, fisheries, endangered species conservation. And I really got drawn into climate change, which I would say now is one of the biggest focuses of what I do, in kind of two different threads that have become more connected to Heterodox Academy than I expected them to.
Yeah.
So the first relates to economic growth, that there's this, coming up as somebody who was a mixture of ecology and economics, I was aware of this debate of, can economic growth be sustainable? And, some people feel really strongly that it can't. Some people feel really strongly that growth has underpinned so many of the major gains in human well-being that we've seen in the last century.
Yeah.
And so I was kind of interested in this topic debate, because I would listen to these arguments and think, that's not actually mutually exclusive, right? It could be that growth has been central to all our well-being and that it's also unsustainable, right?
Yeah.
And so what do we do about that? And then I came across this development in more mainstream macroeconomics, all about how structural forces not related to sustainability, but also that we don't have any control over, things like aging populations, shifts from goods to services, debt, might be slowing down growth in a way that is permanent and unstoppable, for reasons it's inevitable, not it's sustainable or not sustainable. And so the confluence of all three of those things got me really interested of oh boy, this seems like it has really important implications for society. One of which is climate change. And so then I have a colleague who some of your listeners might know of, who's kind of a heterodox guy, named Roger Pilkey Jr. He's in my department. And so he's done a lot of work on the IPCC scenarios and how some of the high emission scenarios are unrealistic, for example, because they project wildly implausible amounts of coal growth in the next century. And so from talking to him, I stumbled across this fact that, well, everybody over forecasts economic growth, which my work and work of some other groups have shown has been the case recently. That also biases, all else equal, the IPCC scenarios economically and in terms of emissions. And so then I started writing papers on that with my colleague Roger Pilkey, and so I got sucked into this world of, what are realistic scenarios. I've gotten interested in adaptation and damages, and there's just enormous uncertainties on the economics of both of those things. So that's kind of the first thread. The second thread where I got interested in climate change relates to political polarization, and I guess, coming up in the environmental fields in academia, almost everybody's on the left, at least at the level of graduate students and faculty. And so I kept hearing this narrative of, on the one hand, we need a society-wide, decades-long energy transition. And on the other hand, we can only trust 1/3 to 1/2 of one party to get that done. And it was like, well, that makes no sense. Yeah. That's just not going to happen. Yeah. And so that got me really interested in this idea of how do you build a big tent climate agenda. And there's actually some good news there. Since, as you probably know, given the topics that you've covered, since about 2015, polarization in a lot of our culture war issues has become supercharged. But actually, polarization on climate has gone ever so slightly the other way, towards being less polarized, at least in terms of certain attitudes, and particularly among young people. So young people of all stripes really do want something done on climate change. And we've done some work, which we maybe talk about later in the show, on how do voters respond to different types of policies, and is it a good idea to pair climate policies with non-climate policies? And this is a big issue, for example, in conversations about environmental justice.
Yeah, Green New Deal stuff, yeah.
Yeah, so we've actually done some research on that, which we can talk about later. But that's basically how I got interested in that. And then separately, I've been concerned about how polarized academia has become. First, because I think it's hurting our ability to achieve our mission, and secondly, because whether or not it's hurting our ability to achieve our mission, it's definitely having measurable negative effects on the trust that we have in society, which I think is essential to our mission, regardless of what we're doing. And so that's what got me interested in Heterodox Academy. And so there are kind of three independent threads that have all become connected in interesting ways, where if I'm gonna study how do we reduce polarization of climate change, because I'm concerned that we need to reduce polarization to get something done on climate change, there's also, I think, a need to get that out of the lab and into society and do some kind of outreach engagements on that, which I've been doing. Also, getting our students thinking about these things in what I would say are more serious and nuanced ways than some narratives would have them think about it. And then also the scenario stuff, that's really gotten me to recognize both the dangers of being not concerned enough about climate change, but also the dangers of catastrophism and alarmism, right? And we can talk about that if you want later or now. I mean, I think there's this idea that is often unstated and unchallenged that it's dangerous to kind of be under concerned. If we underestimate the risks, then we're not going to do enough about it, and that's really dangerous. Whereas if we overestimate the risks, then maybe we'll fix the planet and it won't matter, and it won't matter, but we fix the planet, great, right? And I think that's
what gas prices have to say about that.
Well, that's a short-term point that I think is relevant, but let's take an even bigger picture view of this. There have been some pretty awful atrocities committed on behalf of you know, concerns about environmental catastrophes that turned out to be wrong. So, I think one of the most prominent examples of this would be the one-child policy in China, which, caused the disappearance of millions of girls. And it was in large part motivated by books like The Population Bomb by Paul Ehrlich in the late 60s, which had some predictions like, I think one of his predictions was, 65 million Americans were going to die of starvation by the year 2000. The UK might cease to exist. I think the first sentence of the book was something like, the battle to feed humanity is over, meaning we've lost. And then there was a similar book by this group called the Club of Rome that came out a few years after that. And so that was an atrocity, right? That was, there's a direct line to environmental catastrophism. More broadly, I think there's much more danger than people realize in naive idealism, right? So if you want an environmental example of that recently, look at what's going on in Sri Lanka, where one of the big drivers of their current economic and food security crisis that's toppled their government is that their Berkeley educated president decided that he was going to ban synthetic fertilizers. Because organic is the future. And
the Netherlands too, right? That's happened in Holland too. Something along those lines, something similar with like the farmers. There's something going on where like police are arresting farmers for some sort of fertilizer they're using that's not sustainable, something along those lines.
I want to say I've seen occasional tweets or headlines about that, but I don't know much about what's going on there. But I'm guessing that it's not, mass food insecurity and dramatic increases in poverty for millions of people, which is what's happening in Sri Lanka. So, and if you want to take a broader view than just the environment, the Great Leap Forward, maybe the single deadliest thing that's ever happened in human history, was this program by Mao in China to try to industrialize but also collectivize agriculture, and didn't work. And depending on what estimates you believe, 20 to 50 million people starved. For comparison, I think the Nazi Germany killed something like 12 million people. Right. So so the idea that
there's
that
no
alarmism is now, there is danger in underestimating. Like if we don't do something about the climate, that is dangerous, right? So there is danger in not being considered enough. But I don't think that it's super straightforward to argue that being not concerned enough is worse than being, alarmist. And I also think that the idea that being, naively idealistic and not doing your homework on the details is somehow righteous is just incredibly ahistorical and frankly self-indulgent. And one of the things that I talked about in the talk that you saw is the demographics of people in the US who adopt extreme positions on both sides of the aisle are disproportionately privileged people. They're disproportionately educated, rich white people. And so the idea that, militant, naive extremism is somehow in service to the most marginalized is wrong. And I think more people should find it offensive.
Yeah, like I taught economics I taught an advanced studies economics class. And the way I kind of make it really simple for people who aren't like in the world a little bit or in academia, they think economics, they think like, interest rates and stuff like that. But I think at the core, this is the way I kind of explain it, is it's meeting wants and needs with available resources. And how do we meet the things that we want and need with what we have and have access to? And I think the more that we can do a positive sum play a positive sum economic game as opposed to a zero sum. And the way I explain that would be something like, if there's a river, well, if I take that river, that means it's at the expense of you. Like if the sum is zero and like a something plus something, and it's a positive 5, then it has to be a negative 5. So your benefit comes at the expense of someone else losing. But that's not always the case. There can be positive sum where you get something positive and it's positive for all around. Like that comes through efficiency. We can create aqueducts from that creek and get water to a whole bunch of people or something along those lines. So if we have a problem like climate change, like environmental catastrophes and stuff like that, we have to solve it with the available resources that we have, which are going to be different according to geographic location and things along those lines. But would you say that that's kind of like where your kind of expertise lies, and is how do we address these things with the available resources that we have, that kind of idea? How you apply economics to environmental science, I guess is what I'm asking.
Sort of. I think what you're describing is the way I would maybe slightly rephrase what I think you're getting at is that the idea that the economy and the environment shouldn't be at odds is a more politically palatable and optimistic lens on climate change than the idea that they are at odds. Is that right? Yeah, because the only reason why you wouldn't just put all your eggs in let's save the planet stuff would be because of how that would impact the economy and people's access to resources and stuff like that. Right? Yeah. Okay. So I think we do have to be a little bit careful, right? Because the idea that politically it's a lot easier to sell people on let's help humanity by addressing the economy, by addressing the climate, excuse me. Mm-hmm. Let's grow the economy in a green way. That definitely is a more politically palatable message. And certainly in the immediate term, there's lots of opportunities to push that kind of agenda, right? So renewable energy is really cheap and becoming cheaper by the day, right? So the economics of doing that are already there. That's one of the reasons why the progress on renewable and on the other side of it, the demise of coal, has happened faster than all the major energy agencies thought it would. If you look at, what did the U.S. EIA, the U.S. Energy Agency, or the international one, the IEA, think was going to happen to solar and to coal each year? You get this great, like, they keep revising their coal projections down and they keep revising their solar projections up, right? And a lot of that comes down to the economics. In the US, one of my favorite examples of this is that there was this bill, I want to say it was in 2009, that failed, called the Waxman-Markey bill. Or that was the colloquial term for it. It had some official name. But basically, there was a big climate bill under the Obama administration that narrowly failed. And it had a target for reducing emissions by 2020, which we met anyway, because of, not really because, certainly not because of federal policy, largely because of trends that were happening in the private sector. I think my colleague Roger Pilkey has estimated that something like 60% of it was the rise of natural gas and the way that outcompeted coal, and the rest of it, were things like solar, becoming cheaper faster than we thought. So there's lots of opportunities in the short term to benefit the economy and the climate. I mean, even more broadly than specifically renewable energy, the main thing we have to do now is build stuff, right? Yeah. We've got to, so for example, take electricity, which a lot of people would say is one of the easiest things to do in terms of solving climate change. In the US, decarbonizing our electricity, if you factor in also changes in demand that have to do with, our increasing economy size, plus, we're going to electrify things that are currently not electrified as part of the transition, like cars. We probably have to do something like double the size of the grid and make it all renewable. And it's mostly coal right now, right? I mean, wind and solar is something like, is it 3% or something of the energy? It's coal, natural gas, a little bit of nuclear. I believe, I'm pretty sure it's not, I don't off the top of my head know the breakdown for the US. Yeah. I'm pretty sure it is not majority coal. Okay. What would it be? There's a lot of gas, there's a lot of hydro in some places. Okay. Like, the Pacific Northwest. There's a decent amount of nuclear in some places, although there's a fight to whether we keep that or not. Well, yeah, I wanted to talk about that. Yeah. I'm pretty sure solar and wind are higher than 3%. I'd have to check the numbers, but I'm pretty sure they're higher than that globally, and I'm sure that they're higher in the U.S. than they are globally on average. If you think there's so many poorer countries that have less renewables, so but they are definitely no. I believe it is the case that renewables recently passed coal.
Huh. Like solar and wind.
I think hydro is also included in that, and I also forget. It all just depends on who's doing the accounting.
Yeah, I think like Las Vegas gets a lot from Hoover Dam. I think that's something.
Anyway, I don't know. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but we certainly are trending towards being more renewable. U.S. emissions have fallen by something like 20% in the last 15 years. British emissions have fallen by like 40% in the same time frame. So there's a lot of progress happening, and I would say it's probably more than anything else being driven by economics. Although one of the things that we found is there's actually quite a lot of maybe because A, more and more people on both sides of the aisle want something done, and B, the economics are getting better and better. A former student of mine and I, her name is Renee Marshall, went through climate legislation at the state level since 2015, and we found quite a lot of bipartisan and Republican bills. More Democrat bills, but it was something like 30% of the bills were passed in red states or Republican-controlled governments, and something like a third of the bills were bipartisan. There's a lot of stuff happening. However, to come back to your original point, we have to be careful to not succumb to wishful thinking, in the sense that just because it would be nice for humanity if there were no trade-off between getting to net zero emissions and economic growth, and it would be nice politically, that doesn't make it the case. I don't think that we know that it isn't the case, right? In the short term, there are lots of things that we can do that are popular, that would be good for the economy and would be good for the climate, as evidenced by the fact that our emissions are going down. But I think we have to be careful about all kinds of wishful thinking and explore. Economic growth is I think one area where I think we're likely to face that economic growth. I don't think economic growth is going to stop this century, but I think it's more likely than not that it's going to slow down significantly in rich countries throughout the century, and probably in most middle income countries also. And I think, in fact, I wrote a whole paper about it that came out last year. I think that's going to create a lot of social and fiscal challenges, because we invented a lot of the kinds of institutions and even the discipline of economics were largely created during a time that, if you look in the super long view of history, was probably anomalous in terms of high economic growth. Like, there was very little GDP per capita growth anywhere consistently before the industrial revolutions, and that may be the rule rather than the exception in the kind of ultra long view of the world, right? Or kind of another way to put it is, if the people who say that you can't sustain economic growth forever are right, there's kind of two ways they could be right? The way that they often talk about it is, not only is it not sustainable, we're going to overshoot it basically by spending our non-renewable resource bank account, and then we're going to have to face some kind of catastrophic shortfall. Another possibility is it's not sustainable, and so we just smoothly approach the whatever the limit is, right?
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense from a business standpoint to do that. I think that there has to be something that appeals to, like, when something's bipartisan. I bought a Tesla. We got delivery of it like 2 months ago or something. And it's like, I think people sometimes buy Teslas because they want to be environmentally friendly and stuff like that. But there's also people that get it just because gas prices are ridiculous. And I got it because it was just like, it was very practical. It had, I have a long commute and it has auto drive, and I have 3 kids and it has 6 seats, but I'm also like a sports car guy, and it's faster than a Lamborghini. So it's just like, it hits like all of those things. And I think that if you're going to try to appeal to everyone, it has to be like, this is going to improve lifestyles. This is going to help the environment, all that kind of stuff. You know, I want to get into where the left and the right, like try and steel man kind of their positions. Cause what I hear a lot of is from the left for like the negatives, where I think they're missing is the left talks almost like there's no downside. Like you said, like why would we not just put all our eggs in this basket? But like you said, also, like it's mostly fairly comfortable people, and poor people, they don't care about they care about, do they have heat in the winter? Like that's like, are they going to freeze to death? Are they going to have food on the table? And then I think that's where the left is not looking at the trade-offs, the cost of moving in this direction. And the right, I know smart people who truly believe that it is like a blatant like hoax. It's all just about trying to control people and all that kind of stuff. Like, you know, climate is always changing. You've heard that a million times. Climate is always changing.
Right. It's the sun.
Yeah, like that's all that's happened. We've had ice ages. So those are, I think, are like if I would like the straw man arguments for the left and right. I think you might agree. But like, what are the positives? What do the left get right, and what does the right get right? So we can kind of blend them together and say, these are the true things that we can kind of work with together, as opposed to dealing with the hoax people or the people who say there's no reason why we can't all just go solar tomorrow.
Yeah. So good question. I mean, I think my biggest answer would be, fortunately, the vast majority of citizens, and I would also say experts, including in academia, don't agree with either of those things that you just said, right? So, you know, to take on the far right position, the climate is obviously changing, and we are obviously the primary cause. Now, I'll be a little bit careful in the specifics, just to note for your listeners that, you know, I'm an economist, not a physicist, right?
Yeah.
So
like obvious,
it may
like,
be that I get,
yeah.
No, it is obvious to fit. I'm confident about that.
Yeah,
but when I start getting into the details, you know, forgive me if I don't get the nuances of it exactly right.
Yeah.
You know, in the same way that kind of it sometimes annoys me when physicists tweet things like, my climate model proves we need to abandon capitalism. No, it doesn't. Your climate model proves that the Earth's getting hotter, right?
Right. Yeah. Right.
So, but okay. But the evidence that the climate is warming is overwhelming.
Human caused.
The evidence that it's, in fact, there's, again, you know, correct me if I don't have the nuances of this perfectly, but I believe that I've seen infographics, you know, from physical scientists showing that if we got rid of all of human activities and just left the natural forces, because sure, natural forces do change the climate over long time scales, but those natural forces would probably have made the Earth get colder in the last 50 years, not warmer. So in that sense, you could say that the fraction of our warming that's caused by humans is probably a little bit more than 100%. Right? But, you know, even if you don't buy the modeling that produces that evidence, if you look at the rate at which we've been warming, it's just, nothing else makes sense besides human activities, right? We've warmed in a few decades at a rate that would normally take thousands of years, right? If you kind of look at it's true that there have been times in geological history where the Earth has been warmer than it is today, right? But never has it warmed at anywhere close to the rate that it's currently warming. So it's definitely happening. It's definitely us. It definitely will continue until our emissions get to what people call net zero. So where you know, if we're emitting carbon, we have to be taking carbon out of the atmosphere at the same rate, right? So there's some debate about how hot are we going to get this century, but I think it's important for your listeners to understand that in like the world, the time doesn't end at the end of this century, right? So
Right.
say we get, my group's research and other groups, recent research suggests that, maybe where we're headed is something like 2 to 2.5 degrees currently by 2100, right? And I would say if we stop there, that doesn't meet the IPCC's 1.5 degree target, right? But it's also almost certainly not Armageddon, right? If we're getting to that level, right? That's pretty close to the 2 degree target, which was the original target, right? There are a couple of places where you do have somewhat existential impacts, right? So if we exceed 2 degrees, it's I think quite likely that eventually some island countries like the Marshall Islands and the Maldives will be underwater, right? Now, that's horrible, right? That's catastrophic for the society. Even that, though, is not necessarily, in fact, probably not a catastrophic loss of human life, right? It's happening over the kinds of time scales where people will move. Now, that is disastrous culturally. That is really sad in terms of the history of the world, right? So I understand that I was advocacy by those small island countries that largely led to the IPCC switching from a 2 degree emphasis to a 1.5 degree emphasis, even though the scientific plausibility of us getting to 1.5 degrees is pretty small and shrinking by the day.
Yeah, I mean,
but that's different. But we have to be very. But I think we have to be very careful in the context of natural disaster deaths per capita have been going down for decades. Damages from natural disasters divided by GDP has also been going down for decades in all major world regions. Almost any measure you can name has been improving in terms of human well-being, for decades. I think the one example I can think of where kind of a large-scale trend in human well-being has recently started to turn negative in a negative direction for reasons that are in some part related to climate change, is I believe it's the case that some measures of food security in some parts of Africa have, since in the last 10 to 15 years, have started to, stop getting better and ever so slightly get worse. So that's not good, right? And the hotter we get, if we don't have commensurate development, that's going to continue. To the statistic about natural disaster impacts, relative to GDP and relative to population getting smaller, that is despite the fact that some natural disasters have been getting worse on average because of climate change, right? The reason that those impacts have been improving despite that is adaptation, right? We're building better buildings. Air conditioning is a huge thing. We're talking about heat waves. Yeah. There was a column in the New York Times by David Wallace Wells in the last week that talked about how there was this enormous heat wave recently in India. And some people thought it was going to be this, mass death event. And I want to say his estimate was that, fewer than 100 people have died so far in the whole country. Right. So that's that. And again, that doesn't mean that the heat wave didn't happen, right? It just means that we're adapting. And a big part of the reason we're adapting is our economic things that are either directly or indirectly related to economic growth, right? Our technology is getting better. We're building better buildings. Et cetera. So to your point about, the economy versus climate targets, many of the adaptation avenues run through the economy's getting better. And certainly many of the improvements of well-being in currently poor places run through having abundant, cheap, reliable energy, right? You sometimes see. And again, Twitter, is a biased extreme example of anybody. But sometimes you see, climate activists tweeting things like, we need to ban fossil fuels tomorrow. And it's like, well, okay, you're going to turn the lights off in all of sub-Saharan Africa if you do that. Right.
Yeah. That's, far more people die from, not having access to like cleaner, like they're burning whatever, like a cow poop and like wood in their house and they suffocate from like the smoke. The numbers of that are really, really bad.
Yeah. So that's true. So, and we need to be very careful to not, be so knee-jerk radical
Mhm.
about, getting rid of all of our emissions that we inadvertently make people poor.
Right. It's a balancing act, right? It's like
In the same way as Sri Lanka, in the
Right.
organic agriculture is a great example of that, right?
Yeah.
But on the other hand, right, now, some of my colleagues, and I have argued that maybe, we should have known back then that these scenarios weren't plausible. But, whether or not that's the case,
Are you talking about like
10-ish years ago?
Are you talking about like
whether or not
the
this is the case,
inconvenient truth stuff? Like by this date, this crazy thing's going to happen? Because that I feel like that builds a lot of
like the uninhabitable Earth.
For people to go,
well,
look, they were wrong. Now they're saying this. They're catastrophizing. They're saying this is all going to happen. They've been wrong in all these models, so I'm not listening to them anymore. It's almost like you burn that bridge.
Okay, well, so one of the things I think when you're talking about models and their track record, it's very important to draw a distinction between models and scenarios that are trying to predict emissions and models and scenarios that are trying to predict warming. The models and scenarios that have been trying to predict warming, kind of taking emissions as an input, have been incredibly accurate for 50 years. So there have been a few studies that have shown this, but one person who I think is really good in general on the climate issues, Zeke Housefather from the he's not. I was going to say from the Breakthrough Institute, but he recently moved to Stripe.
Okay.
And so he had a study that came out in the last couple of years that basically showed that the physical climate models have been incredibly accurate in terms of predicting what the effect of emissions is going to be on
so
the climate.
what wasn't accurate then? Because like when you watch
so hang on, I'm getting to that. Okay, so the predictions about where emissions were heading have been in the last couple decades have been decently inaccurate. And if you look at what some of those scenarios project in the future, probably that they're very unrealistic. Now, but to be fair to the people who make these scenarios, they mostly were not designed to be predictive, right? So the people who run scenarios for the IPCC, they are charged with coming up with a whole range. So they have scenarios that simulate people getting to humanity getting to 1.5 degrees, which also is probably not realistic on the low end, right? And then they have these scenarios that get to kind of 4 and 5 degrees by 2100 that are probably unrealistic on the high end. Now, for whatever reason, I think the kind of how much it became implausible, how perceivable that was is a little bit debatable, but for whatever reason, I would say about 10 years ago, the mainstream view among climate experts was that we were on a pathway that was headed towards these kind of high-end 4 to 5 degree scenarios by 2100. And if you run the implications of those, some of them are really scary, right? So like the most populous regions of the world in the tropics have literally unlivable temperatures for 300 days a year by 2100, right? The book, The Uninhabitable Earth, by David Wallace kind of runs through a lot of those things. Now, so given that mainstream thinking was we were on that trajectory back then, and that trajectory, if you take it literally, is really, really bad, I think that's where some of what we I think now would call alarmism came from. And I think it also got mixed in with, we can talk about later, I think there's been this general kind of social media driven trend of performative extremism that's on the left manifested as what you might call histrionics, and climate's kind of been taken into that along with some other things. But so it's become clear that we're not on that trajectory now, partly because of progress we've made in technology, right? That we were talking about earlier, partly because it turns out that those scenarios had been assuming that today's middle income and developing countries were going to kind of go all in on coal in a way that is kind of more extreme than what we did in rich countries, right? Which doesn't make sense. And, some people argue that there isn't even enough coal for them to do that.
Right.
For whatever reason, it's certainly unrealistic. Like, for example, the International Energy Agency, which has historically been too pessimistic. In other words, they've tended to overproject how much coal we would have. They say coal per capita is going to decline by about half by 2050 under stated policies. So kind of business as usual. And some of these hot scenarios have coal per capita going up by a factor of 3 to 6 by 2100. So that's just not going to happen. And then on top of that, even if you go all in on coal, in order to demand enough energy to get that hot by 2100, you have to have just, I think, completely bonkers economic growth scenarios where, you've got every region of the world having a GDP per capita of over $100,000 in today's dollars by 2100. And so you look at these scenarios and you're like, wait a second, you expect me to believe that all three of the following are true? We're all in on coal, so we don't care about climate. It's impossible to live for people in the most populous places in the world, and everybody's super rich all at the same time. That makes no sense, right? So I would say that taking those scenarios literally in terms of 2100 impacts now is alarmist and out of step with the science, as the IPCC acknowledged in their most recent report that came out in the last year. However, I would also say to folks on maybe on the center and the center right, that time doesn't stop in 2100, right? And so if we don't get to zero, then eventually we will get that hot, right? Whether it's one or 200 years or 300 years in the future, and it probably will be really bad. So don't take your foot off the gas. But also, I really worry. Mental health is an issue I'm just privately passionate about, and and so when I see statistics like 4 in 10 young people are afraid to have kids because of climate change, I think that makes you really sad. And I think that to the extent that people in my profession are encouraging that type of thinking, I think we're doing a great disservice to our students and young people.
So I remember watching Inconvenient Truths in the theaters, whatever, 2003 or 4 or whatever it was, and they were saying, this Miami be underwater and blah blah blah. Isn't part of that though, like, it's like saying if you continue driving in this direction, you'll eventually hit that wall. It's like, yeah, but I'm gonna turn. Like we do have changes, as you said, like technology changes, like things change. So it could be like this was accurate at the time, but that can't factor in what kind of advancements do we have, who would have seen this coming, who would have seen that coming. Like, it's not so simple. So for the people who say, well, they were wrong about these models and wrong about these models, yeah, but why? And just because that's the case doesn't mean that there isn't something still to be focused on. So to steel man the what you might call the liberals in that story, right? There is an element of Merton's self-defeating prophecy here, right? If we say if we don't do anything, it's going to be really bad, and then that motivates people to do something, you can't go back and say, well, you were wrong. Right. That's a good point. Yeah.
So I think there's a grain of truth to that. I think there's also a grain of truth to the fact that we just haven't been, in terms of predicting technology trends and economic growth trends, independently of policy. I think we were wrong about some of those things. I think we probably were unrealistically bullish on the future of coal in some of these models. But I also think, like, if you're trying to predict the long-term future of anything, you're going to be wrong a lot of the time, right? There's just huge irreducible uncertainty. Like, how many people besides Bill Gates predicted COVID, right? Very, very, very few, right? How many people predicted the Great Recession? A handful, but not that many. So I think that I think it's fair to point to a couple of these areas and say, the people who project emissions got it wrong. But I don't think that they kind of stand out in the overall discipline of scientists who make predictions. as being particularly bad.
Yeah, it just gets used as a way to say like, well, I'm not going to listen anymore. Like you burn me type of thing. Bjørn Lomborg gets brought up a lot. It's more on like right-wing circles, I think, but his work with like how to spend money and how important is a climate change, the focus and stuff like that. He's a pretty prominent name, and you and I talked briefly in Denver about it, but can you just share your thoughts on what he, is essentially just like, briefly, just like what does he get right and what does he get wrong by kind of your analysis? Like, what is your critique?
Yeah,
because this is your lane, and I'm fine critiquing other educators on their approach and saying this is good, bad, but like, what would you say he gets right and what would you say that he misses the target on?
So, in the interest of nuance, and I'll just be a bit careful at the outset and just say, I'm not intimately familiar with all of his work. Mm-hmm. Right. But I will say that I have encountered I would say he's by sort of the average, mainstream, skeptical, serious climate person, not the kind of histrionic far left person. I think has some critiques of his work that, at least in the areas of his work that I have looked at, have a grain of truth to them. So for example, he has a paper that looks at these hot scenarios, right? And one of the things it says is like, look, in these hot scenarios, everybody's super rich. So basically what's the problem? Mm-hmm. Right? And it's like, yeah, sure. If you take it literally, I guess I kind of buy that, but like, you can't kind of 1 minute say these hot scenarios are unrealistic, partly because we're rich, and then at the second point say, we're rich, so what's the problem, right? So there's sort of I think that there's I think that he's an example of somebody who I think is I think his overall value to the conversation is probably positive, and some of my colleagues, I'm sure, would disagree on that. In the sense that I think he kind of can be a good foil, the sort of steel man, but I think that he also he sometimes is a bit loose and a little bit cherry picky and a little bit kind of agenda driven in a way that delegitimizes when the points that he makes that are valid, because it kind of feeds into the narrative that he's, a contrarian or whatever. I would encourage if you want somebody who's very rigorous and isn't afraid to, call out alarmism when they see it, I would say, people like Zeke Housefather or my colleague Roger Pielke Jr. Are two, that I think are better people to follow and read than Lomborg or Kunin would be another example. But I wouldn't say that either Kunin or Lomborg are, deniers. I just think that they're a little bit loose sometimes in ways that are a little bit unhelpful, although in, with the caveat that I'm not, intimately familiar with all their work. And so, you always have to be a little bit careful about, like, you don't criticize the syllabus if you haven't read it. Right?
For sure. Yeah. The last thing I want to talk about is nuclear energy. Like, I'm actually working right now to get a nuclear engineer on just to kind of flush this out, because I know nothing, but it seems like that is something that should be included, because from what I do understand, and I might be off on some of this, but what I do understand is that Fukushima and 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, those are older style, that the technology has advanced a lot, that is, very clean. It could be used. I mean, we think about like the Jetsons, you think about the future, you think nuclear everything, like what's going on with that? Because I mean, I think that seems like something that would be very environmentally friendly. I mean, I don't know, but for whatever reason, it's not included. Like, it wasn't in the Green New Deal. It doesn't get included very much when we talk about changing climate change. Why is that? What am I missing? Because again, I'm so ignorant.
And again, I'll be careful to say that, nuclear isn't my main focal area either, but kind of from what I understand from being in a lot of these conversations and, learning by osmosis is the following. I think I think nuclear is, there's no question that nuclear, by almost any measure, maybe literally any measure, is much safer than any kind of fossil fuels. And, by some measure, it's certainly much less waste generating and energy dense than most, all renewables basically.
Yeah, can I just jump in real quick?
And hang on, I just wanted to do your Fukushima point.
Yeah.
So the point about major meltdowns, even those, if you sort of compare, like, say, to the deaths that were caused by, pollution from coal, it still comes out looking like a very safe source of energy. But you're also correct, as far as I understand it, that the newer nuclear technologies are much safer even than those technologies were. So I think there's kind of there's three sources of critique that I think are not, rational in the sense of kind of a calculated approach to the question. One source of nuclear caution, I think, is the fact that, if you do have a meltdown, even though it doesn't kill that many people, you can't live there for decades, right? And so that just kind of viscerally, if you're a community, right, think about it, like, do I want a nuclear reactor in my town, even if the odds of that happening are really, really, really small? It's just kind of a mental block. And yeah, you could say to the people, like, if you put some other plant, you're going to have, pollution that's going to kill you more, right? There's kind of rational arguments that counter arguments to that, but I understand why people have, viscerally have that feeling. The second thing is, some pro-nuclear people have criticized some anti-nuclear people on the grounds that, nuclear energy is, industrial, it's high tech, it's probably going to come from rich countries and make rich countries richer, by selling it. And so, if your real agenda is, some kind of, utopian anti-capitalist revolution, and you're using climate change as kind of a convenient issue to wrap that agenda in, then nuclear is frustrating because it's, it doesn't do that, and obviously nobody says, like, oh, I'm against nuclear because I want to wrap myself in my anti-capitalist agenda in climate. But I do think that there's probably a grain of truth to that for some people. The second thing that I think is somewhat related is there can be an appeal to nature fallacy in environmentalism, right? The appeal to nature fallacy is that if something's natural, it's good. Which isn't always true. And I think that, people who have this kind of quasi-spiritual connection to nature are naturally drawn to environmental movements. And I can see why something like nuclear versus something like solar is different. But again, in terms of, like, the cost benefits to society, I don't think that's a super rational argument. Okay, so what are arguments? I'm trying to remember if I've covered all three. No, I think I have covered all three. It's the anti-capitalism cloaked as environmentalism, the visceral impact of you can't live here for decades, and the appeal to nature. What are some of the legitimate critiques of nuclear? One is that it takes a long time to build, and unlike most technologies, the trend in many places has been that it's become more expensive and not cheaper, right? And so if we need to, I think there are some people that argue, I want to be careful not to put words in anyone's mouth, but I want to say that, there's the one executive director of Project Drawdown named John Foley. I want to say he's tweeted before or written blogs before about, how whatever you think of nuclear, if we want to get emissions down, immediately, like in the next decade, nuclear isn't going to be driving the bus for these logistical and economic reasons. And I think that's a reasonable argument. And I think, what I draw from that is, like, and again, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I feel like I've heard Foley make similar arguments that, you want a both and approach, right? Like the idea that it's, or that, he calls it silver buckshot instead of a silver bullet, right? Let's build nuclear or not, but that's not going to, even if we do, it's not going to, avoid the need for also building more things like wind and solar. And then the third thing that I think is, not a relevant issue maybe in the time scale of this century, but is eventually, is that, at least until we can get to fusion, is that the, uranium is not a renewable resource. Right now we have a ton of it, right? And we've been discovering it. I want to say that in the last few decades, the amount that we've discovered is something like, half or more of all the uranium we've ever used, right? So the the scarcity implied in it being an unrenewable resource is not really going to be relevant on any kind of near-term timescale, but it is an unrenewable resource. At some point, you can't have society go to infinity without eventually not using non-renewable resources.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, I just wanted to clear up, like when you say waste, like the natural thinking people, like I just want wind and solar, let's run our houses on, good feelings. The problem is these solar panels, they have like a life, and then what do you do with them? I live in California and we have giant wind turbines, but if they break, I mean, it's a lot of waste. So, I've read about like, the solar panels and what are they going to do if everything's solar panels and then they die out? What do you do with those solar panels? There's no real way, as far as I know, to like recycle them in anything that's that efficient yet. Same thing with wind turbines. So when people say wind and solar is just so obvious because there's no trade-off, there's no drawbacks, there's no cost. Just like everything in economics, right? Everything is a trade-off. Everything has a cost. There's no such thing as a free lunch. So I think that needs to be recognized. I don't know if people understood that.
I think, I mean, to what extent is that in the mainstream is a good question. I don't know the answer to. Certainly, the waste is an issue, and the recycling, doesn't. I don't know of a reason kind of offhand why it's impossible, but it's true that we need to improve the technology to do it. So there's work to do there. The mining, the sourcing of rare earth metals is something that we need to pay attention to, especially in a geopolitical climate
and stuff
where
like
people
that.
are retreating from globalization. A huge fraction of these things come from China, right? Which, isn't always a reliable global partner. So we need to be thinking about these things. Maybe to bring back your point about polarization or the question about polarization, I think one of the really interesting things about climate change, if I think about, the next 2 decades, is that it still is, more a left-wing issue than a right-wing issue, but we also really need some ideas that are maybe traditionally right-wing applied to it, right? So there's I want to say it was Ezra Klein who wrote this column in particular, but there have been similar ones, I think, by Matt Iglesias and some other folks that your listeners might know of, that basically pointed out that, the environmental movement from the 70s until now, most of its toolbox has been how do you stop stuff from happening, right? And or maybe how do you push government spending on some things. But mainly it's like, pollution. We need to stop people from polluting. We need to stop people from, drilling on public lands. We need to stop, various things. And solving climate change is going to require building a lot of things. And there are some examples where some environmental groups have been actively hindering to this, right? So a clear-cut example would be, I believe, the Sierra Club recently opposed a pipeline for hydropower going from Quebec to northeastern U.S. I forget what the grounds were, but probably they didn't like where it was going. Right, and so that's just not good. I mean, there's lots of green opposition to nuclear. I believe the Green Party in Germany is shutting down their nuclear. It's going to be replaced with coal.
They're getting from Russia, and they're funding Russia's war. I mean,
exactly. Well, and it's coal, right? I think a lot of whatever you think about how much we need to build new nuclear as opposed to other things, I think the environment or the environmental argument for closing existing nuclear is incredibly weak. And even most people I know who kind of have, nuanced critiques of nuclear as a long-term solution, as far as I've seen, they mostly agree that we shouldn't be closing down nuclear plants that are already open and functioning well and safe. Diablo Canyon in California being an example. But then also there are examples like, again, I want to say this was Ezra Klein pointed out an example of in New York City, the state government, the local government, and the federal government all agree, and the voters all agree that they want congestion pricing. And congestion pricing from an environmental perspective is a no-brainer, right? People are going to drive less, right? Yeah. And yet there's, regulations that are in place still require somebody to write some several thousand-page environmental impact report before it can go into place. So you have this policy that's like congestion pricing. You're not building anything, right? It's a super, super simple policy that you could
explain that just real quick, like in simple terms.
Yeah, basically you have, I'm not sure exactly how it would work in New York, but the idea basically is that people have to pay to drive in high congestion areas.
Yeah.
So this isn't even, you're not building anything. All you're doing is adding a tax basically. And I want to say they said it will be at least until 2024 that they can do this, right? If that's the scale that we build things, it's just not going to happen fast enough, right? If we have to, if any solar farm or wind farm has to go through, decade of environmental reviews and, a decade of negotiation with, 60 different communities, right? It's just not going to happen fast enough. Yeah. And so you're probably going to need some kind of supply side reducing regulation, streamline kind of economics applied to this. So that's, those are historically kind of right-wing ideas, but applied to this historically left-wing domain. And the thing I kind of think is sort of which party is going to figure this out first, right? That building things, renewable energy, these are all popular. What's becoming increasingly unpopular is both do nothing, which too often has been the conservative approach, but also this sort of like histrionic, we're all going to die kind of narrative. And so it's kind of those things where like the voters are sort of coming to the middle. If you're going to look at polls, one of the things we haven't had a chance to talk about is that ties this issue to other cultural issues is we have a couple of studies, one that's out, one that we've written but haven't published yet, that basically shows that if you tie the kind of left-wing cultural progressive rhetoric and policies, that people call woke, to climate, we both see that it reduces the odds of being bipartisan in real bills, but also it turns off voters who are both moderate and conservative. And so I guess what I'm saying is there's sort of like there are losing strategies for climate on both sides, and it'll be interesting to see who gets to the middle first. In the US, I think at the federal level, the Republicans are still, I think, further away from the popular position because there's still too much do nothing. At the state level, there's some interesting positive things happening on the Republican side, and there's some seeds of hope on the Republican side. At the federal level, there's this thing called the Conservative Climate Caucus that was started by Representative John Curtis from Utah, that I think has like a third of the Republican House members signed up for, and it's basically like, it's real, we want to do something, we want to bring our own ideas. So I think that's great, and that's going to force, if the Republicans have provide a serious alternative, that competition is going to force, I think, the Democrats to focus on their better, more popular ideas. But you see in other countries, this convergence has gone farther. So, whatever you think about Boris Johnson as a person, I think some of his scandals are a little off-putting, but whatever you think about that, whatever you think of Brexit, he has unquestionably been I think one of the best examples of a conservative politician who's won on a serious climate platform. Like I said, Britain has been steadily declining their emissions. I believe that he increased the ambition of their targets while he was in office rather than decreasing them. I believe he also increased funding from the National Health Service. So there are examples of conservative parties moving off of their relatively unpopular laissez-faire economic policies at times, and they're or kind of pro-rich, maybe is more accurate in terms of what's unpopular than laissez-faire, and they're kind of do-nothing climate approach. And there are, I think, some signs of hope in terms of some left politicians too. So I think about people like Richie Torres, Eric, who's the congressman from the South Bronx, Eric Adams, who are both like, we want to do something about poverty and helping poor people. We want to do something about climate, but we also know that you need to tackle crime to help, poor communities. And Richie Torres talks about how, there's a profile he had in the New York Times where he said something like, I'm a progressive, but the Jacobins coming out of humanities departments scare me, right? So I think that there's a, the wisdom of crowds is slowly taking us in good directions, and maybe on climate as much or more than almost any other issue. So I'm cautiously optimistic in the future.
Yeah, I think that's accurate, that we're moving more to the center on this one than we are in others. You know, this was great. We already did over an hour. It's so nuanced, but the left and the right working together, with the left, you know, I always explain it kind of like the left is like all of these people, some wacky ideas, some great ideas, trying to get into a club, and the conservatives are like the doorman, like, no, not you. Oh, you? Yeah, that's not bad. And like through that process, I think that we get to some good ideas, because the progressives are kind of the pedals pushing the bike forward, and then the conservatives are like, hold on, we got to slow down a little bit so we don't hit a brick wall type of idea. You know, if I tell my young students who want to be engineers and stuff, like, you know, I want to be entrepreneurs, like, there's a problem going on right now, and you can solve this and become a billionaire. Like, there's real money to be made in renewable energy. There's, you know, because it will create more of, as I said, like a positive sum game where you can make a lot of money and you can help environmental issues and you can get energy to people who don't have it, who are poor. Like, that's what a problem to solve, and you are here to do it. So it's very complex. But I appreciate you kind of working through that nuance. And it's a little, I think some people will probably be like, that's heavy, you know, because it is very, you know, it's very deep. It's very complex in the way we understand this, but I hope that we got a good understanding of like what's going on. Yeah.
So if you'll permit me, I'd like to leave
Please.
Your listeners with the following thought.
Absolutely.
Right. So one is, you know, when we are at the Heterodox Academy meeting, I think what it said on the tote bags was, great minds don't always think alike. Yeah. And I think the best ideas on this are going to come from collaboration across the spectrum. And also, it's just not going to happen if we don't do it. At least the government, or at best, the government's going to be useless and the private sector is going to figure it out, right? Mm-hmm. And so if you want specific motivation to come to the table for each side, I would say to conservatives and Republicans, on the one hand, your voters, especially your young ones, want you to come to the table. On the other hand, one of the things we found in our research is that the Democrats tend to vote for almost every climate policy. The Republicans are a little bit more picky about picking their own. So kind of to your point about letting people in the door, if the Republicans come to the table and get serious, they have some bargaining power, right? Yeah. In terms of bringing their ideas, but they have to get serious. And if the choice is, you know, do things that they don't like versus do nothing, more and more the voters are going to choose do things that they don't like. So that's what I say to conservatives. What I'd say to progressives is, if you think it's an emergency, then start acting like you believe that, right? And if you're being wheeled into the hospital needing life-saving heart surgery, you're not going to say to the doctor, well, hang on, wait a second, what do you think about abortion? Oh no, don't, I'm going to die, don't operate on me, right? So, you know, ignoring the fact that you need to work together to get it done isn't serious. Yeah. Saying that you can only get it done if we also do these 6 or 7 other things that, you know, polling shows is only popular among, you know, rich white elite coastal progressives. Yeah. What you're subconsciously saying to voters is, we don't actually care about the climate. We don't actually think it's an emergency. What we really care about is those other things, right? And so I think that there is an incentive for both sides to come to the table and work together constructively, maybe more on this issue than almost any other, because it is serious. We do need to do something, and we're not going to get it done if we don't work together.
Yeah, I love that. Dr. Matthew Burgess, thank you so much for coming here, having this conversation with me. Do you have any like public stuff where people can see your work or anything like that?
Yeah, probably the best place to go would be my website, www.mattgburgess.ca.
Okay.
I'll probably change the .ca at some point. I'm Canadian.
Okay.
I was saying I'm Canadian originally. I still am Canadian.
Yeah.
I have a green card. You know, probably get a naturalized.
Report, yeah.
But yeah. So that's my website, mattgburgess.ca.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you so much for diving into this, and I don't know, maybe I'm more confused than ever, but I love the message. I think that's really great about working together. So thank you for coming, and I hope that my kids will look back and be like, all right, well, yeah, it was something, and we created these things, and we're better now. It's the hope.
Sorry, allergies. But yeah, thanks a lot for having me, and keep having these nuanced conversations, and keep role modeling that for your students, because I think that's really powerful. And I think that this age of social media driven rancor is harmful, clearly harmful enough to young people, that I'm optimistic that the generation coming up is going to start to reject it and yearn for more nuance and more seriousness. And I feel like I see that with the students that I teach at CU, which is a large state school in a purple state. And so I appreciate what you're doing, especially since K-12 teachers don't have tenure. So it's probably riskier for you to take these things on than it is for me, even though I don't have tenure yet.
For sure. Cool. All right. Well, thank you so much. All right. We'll talk in the future.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah. See ya.